My name is John Gibert. I'm a professor in the classics department. I was hired as a specialist in Greek literature and language with a focus on poetry. I do a lot with drama, most of all tragedy, but all Greek poetry starts with Homer, and so that's part of what I do as well. I started in 1992, so I just finished up my 34th year here at CU Boulder. Homer's Odyssey is named after its main character, Odysseus, who's a Greek warrior who went on the famous expedition against Troy to retrieve Helen, the face that launched 1,000 ships. The Trojan War gave rise to a whole bunch of stories, and all of the Greeks who didn't die during the war had after stories too about their homecoming. So a Greek would have called the Odyssey a nostos story, a homecoming story. Odysseus is the one that went on steroids, so to speak, because he's such an interesting and complicated character that he just accumulated more and more story elements and adventures, as well as having a complicated re-entry into his domestic scene. So fully half of Homer's Odyssey is about the return of this warrior from a 10-year war after 10 years of wandering into his household. And so only a few days are covered by fully half of the poem, in which he comes in disguise because he's not sure of the situation and he's not entirely sure of the faithfulness of his wife. So these are the suitors. There are traditionally more than 100 of them, and Odysseus alone, or with the help of just a few of his most trusted household members, has got to reestablish himself in his rights as the king of Ithaca, his home island. So the story is set in what we would call late Bronze Age Greece, and that's roughly the 1100s BCE. And we can tell that because of the material circumstances in the way that the story is told. So all kinds of indications converge to say this is a late Bronze Age story, but the story was told, or at least reached the form in which we have it, only 400 years later, in what we call the Iron Age, when material circumstances had drastically changed and were, on the whole, poorer, or at least less rich at the top. So there are a number of things we want to understand about that. First is that this is an oral storytelling medium in which people can be trained to compose spontaneously. They've done it many times before. They can reconfigure the poem to suit the occasion, which also could mean that they could give you a version of the Odyssey story in 12 lines, or 100 or 1,000, or as we have it in 12,000 lines. And these are, broadly speaking, they're called the Homeric question, but it's a series of interlocking questions about for how long the stories were told before they were perfected, or at least crystallized into the versions that got written down. How did they get written down? Who sponsored it? Who had the ability to carry out a project of that scope? All these interrelated questions have been asked for centuries, but a decisive turn was taken about 100 years ago when an American scholar, following the lead of a Slavicist and a French linguist, kind of figured out that this was a live storytelling medium, that the language has been adapted for that rapid composition and adaptability. It meant that we should now be looking for analogs in other societies of oral storytelling about, let's just say, heroic or epic events, because they exist many, many places in the world. But this same American scholar also took the crucial next step, which was going out into the field and recording in the 1930s some Serbo-Croatian singers of heroic poems who were still doing this very thing. So to get to your question about traces, there are some things when we look at the Odyssey that we have that we imagine could have been told differently. For example, the poem is extremely patriarchal. It sidelines Penelope over and over again, usually by sending her to her room to fall asleep until some important next stage of the action is over with. She's just sidelined. And we might think, if we're modern people who appreciate stories where there are stronger, purposeful women who have agency within the stories. We might like to imagine a way of telling the Odyssey in which that was the case. And some people think that there are some traces of that in the Odyssey. Let me give you an example. I guess the best one is the contest of the bow, that only Odysseus has the ability to shoot an arrow straight through 12 axe heads, and Penelope sets as a contest for the suitors. After a long conversation with Odysseus, who is still disguised as a beggar, she simply says, well, Telemachus is growing a beard now. It's time for me to remarry. I'm going to set up a contest tomorrow and let the suitors have a go at this. And one question that people have in reading the Odyssey is, has she now figured out that this man in disguise that she's saying this to is actually her husband? It serves to build suspense, but there are a couple of puzzling details about the way it's set up. And then when it actually goes down, all the suitors have a go and fail. But then when somebody says, let's give the beggar a chance, the suitors object. Penelope counters their objections. And then Telemachus steps in and says, Mom, why don't you go up to your bedroom and fall asleep? And she does. So the contest which she herself, in our Odyssey, sets up, reaches its climax in her absence. And you just have to wonder if that is the only way that story was ever told. Although it's got beauties of its own in postponing the recognition and, safeguarding the delicate Penelope's feelings so she doesn't see all those suitors slaughtered and so on. So a lot of Greek names that feature in well-known myths and stories are transparent in their meaning. Penelope is a duck. Menelaus and Agamemnon both have warrior names that mean that they can withstand the enemy onslaught. But some names are less transparent, and in fact, scholars, linguists cannot tell us exactly what the name Odysseus means or where it comes from. It may not even be Greek. However, the poets of the Odyssey do like wordplay, and so they associate the sound of the name Odysseus with two different verbs in Greek, one of which just means to grieve, but the sound relationship is actually closer with a less common word that means either to anger or to be hated. So the poem is just playing with etymological possibilities, but we call it a false etymology because we don't have good linguistic evidence that that's where the name Odysseus itself actually comes from. So he is, first of all, one of those Homeric warriors. He's also, of course, a clever strategist who's got a good plan for espionage or a good plan for ending the war by inventing the Trojan horse. And so he is both clever and somebody whose cleverness shades over into trickiness. And so then in that direction, he becomes ethically complex too, because he certainly doesn't mind telling a useful lie. And he also relishes storytelling, in the Odyssey especially. I've read where Christopher Nolan describes all of his previous storytelling on screen as versions or derivatives of the Odyssey. So one can imagine that for him it's been a long cherished ambition to go back to the source and do this. And I don't think we're talking tens of millions of dollars. I think we're talking, $250 million or something like that. I think I've seen a number like that. It's hard to imagine not having a scene where we see Odysseus becoming known to his father, because just like his wife, his father has waited all these years for his return as well. And it's a notoriously troubling scene in Homer's version because the man, his name is Laertes, has moved out to the countryside. He's effectively abdicated and mortified his flesh because he's so despondent about the absence of his son. He starts by sort of teasing and delaying this recognition in a way that torments his father before he comes clean. And it seems like an act of gratuitous cruelty almost, and it's the kind of scene that make people sometimes see Odysseus as a character driven by some internal imperative that he's not really in control of, to push a little further than he should in self-assertion or in trickery. Because really, give the old man a break, I'm your son, I'm home. So, there are some ways of telling the Odyssey that I personally wouldn't be excessively thrilled to see. Nothing wrong with him if he's a comic book action hero. That's just not my thing. What I mean by a cartoonish hero, though, is one who's ethically very simple. And I find the complexity, including the ethical complexity of Odysseus, more compelling than the simple version. There's a default version in which it's just, Matt Damon in sword and sandals facing physical threats and, being a victorious action hero. It was a, roughly speaking, impoverished era relative to the late Bronze Age. But it was a time when Greece was gathering ahead of steam again for expanding its population, colonizing, getting around the Mediterranean, renewing trade contacts and the economy and things like that. So as part of this, lots of parts of the Greek world were looking for new places to inhabit. And there's a notorious description of the island where the Cyclops lives, which pauses to describe what an excellent place it would be to set up a Greek colony. So, we live in an age that's struggling with colonialism and trying to move towards post-colonialism in many ways. It will matter to some audience members, I think, how Odysseus is portrayed in this light when he goes around the world and encounters, difference or the other, right? Is he genuinely curious and inquisitive, the way the opening of the poem implies, or is he just bent on enriching himself by extracting natural resources, as some of the episodes clearly imply? And so Storyteller has lots of options, and can also try to incorporate multiple options and give audiences complexity to cope with. So there are a lot of reasons why people study classics. We can also talk about the way that we study it and the value that has, the portable skills that come out of it. And my love, as I mentioned, was originally for language and how it works. And it turns out that that's a real gymnastics for the mind. Greek and Latin are good ones, and then they have these other benefits that the stuff that you can read in Greek and Latin is wonderful, and the stuff that we can learn about the culture through its material remains, archaeology and travel, is wonderful. If you can persuade people to put everything aside and immerse themselves in a book, and that's a big ask sometimes these days, but if you can, most people like it. They just discover that they like it. At least a significant percentage do, and there's something in it for everybody.